Hey, it's Jordan with TYT Network. I am interviewing Ari Berman today from thenation.com. We talked to Ari a few weeks ago when Wisconsin primary shenanigans was going on in terms of voting rights. Ari is an expert on voting rights, voter suppression, wrote a really riveting book on the topic. Ari, I want to start with the New York election lawsuit, how the Voting Rights Act being gutted by the Supreme Court affected New York?
Yeah, absolutely, Jordan. And thank you for having me, and hello from scenic Capitol Hill. So one of the things the Voting Rights Act did is it required those states with a long history of voting discrimination to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And interestingly enough, that covered many states in the South, but also places outside of the South, including three boroughs of New York: Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. And so when Brooklyn did this major voter purge and purged 126,000 registered Democrats, that is the type of thing that would have been reviewed under the Voting Rights Act, except the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, and thus not just the states of the South, but also places like Brooklyn no longer have to approve their voting changes with the federal government.
Mm-hmm. And what did Brooklyn change, or New York City change, specifically about their voting methods that previously they would have had to get pre-clearance?
Well, it's not clear that they changed anything per se, but the fact is they decided to remove 126,000 registered Democrats, which is a very large number of voters. And so that is something that I think the Justice Department would have wanted to review, and they would have had to notify the Justice Department about this. Voter purges have been blocked previously under the Voting Rights Act. Texas did a major voter purge in 1975, and it was blocked under the Voting Rights Act. Florida tried to do a major voting purge in 2012, and it was blocked under the Voting Rights Act. So I'm saying, regardless of the intention here, this is something that would have more than likely been reviewed under the Voting Rights Act.
And I'm not an election law expert, but my understanding is if people are taken off the list, from Democrat, moved elsewhere, independent, Republican, whatever, they need to be notified of this in order to be inactive. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Usually what happens is they'll send out a mailing to people and let them know that they may be taken off the rolls. The problem is a lot of times this is based on inaccurate data. So people never get the mailings, then they're removed, and then they show up and they're no longer registered. And this happened not just in New York in the last election, but it's happened many, many other times in other states. And this is the problem with these voter purges. If you're going to purge the voting rolls, you shouldn't do it right before an election, and you should give people plenty of time to make sure they're notified, and you shouldn't just remove them without them having any recourse to challenge it.
Right. I've also been hearing of, there's been a lot talked about New York's arcane deadline 6 months before a primary to switch. If you're independent, Republican, and you want to switch to Democrat, you had to do it 6 months before. But I've personally been reached out to by several people who did it by the deadline, were then got a mail saying, oh, we didn't receive your switch till a few days after the deadline, so you can't register. Two of those, you can't vote as a Democrat. Two of those people went down to the court to get court orders to vote on primary day, and the Board of Elections actually had on file that they had received their party switch by the deadline. Yeah. So obviously you don't know all cases, but there seems to me that there's just a lot of incompetence going on.
Yeah. I think that the New York Board of Elections, unfortunately, has been incompetent in many different election cycles. And the fact that this was such a hotly contested primary brought more attention to this. The fact that there was such an absurd registration deadline brought more attention to it. And there was two problems, as you mentioned. One was people who did register in time, who weren't on the rolls even though they should be. And the other thing was, why do people have to register 6 months before a primary? That doesn't make any sense. So if you're going to have a closed primary, I think you have to have something like election day voter registration so people can show up and register that day if they want to participate in the party, because so many people who wanted to participate in the Democratic or Republican Party were not able to because of these laws. And I think the Democratic Party took a very short-sighted view of this, and they could have engaged thousands of Bernie supporters that wanted to participate, that could have helped the Democratic Party in future elections, and instead they shut them out.
And, obviously I'm cynical, I'm with TYT. So, but, New York has the earliest deadline to change party affiliation 6 months before. I get the feeling that part of it is the Democratic Party isn't that eager in New York to have as many people as possible to vote. Closed primaries in general. The idea goes that the party establishment want to control those states, particularly ones with a lot of delegates, so that independents don't vote, and it's mostly Democrats who vote. Do you think that the early registration to switch party has anything to do with maybe they're not as interested in grassroots activists in favor of a Bernie Sanders?
I think that in New York, both parties want to preserve the status quo. And this well predates Hillary Clinton's candidacy. The laws have been bad in Albany for a very long time. And I think it's unfortunate that many Democratic incumbents want to preserve the status quo and many Republican incumbents want to preserve the status quo. I think that we should have much more competitive elections in New York. I think we should have much fairer voting laws. I think that the fact is New York is the fourth most progressive state, quote unquote, in the nation, but our voting laws don't reflect that. And we could be a leader on voting rights. Instead, we've become a laughingstock based on everything that's occurred this election.
Right. And you and I spoke previously. You're neutral. You're not for Hillary, for Bernie. And you don't think this is some nefarious rigging that Hillary Clinton did. Contrary to people hating me on Twitter, I haven't been pushing that. I have no proof that Hillary Clinton's involved with any of this. I would give her the benefit of the doubt that she's not. But it seems odd to me, and maybe you could correct the record, many people think Brooklyn would have leaned towards Bernie Sanders. It's where he was born, a lot of young areas, and Hillary Clinton won by 20%, I believe you said. Why was Brooklyn the only place that had this significant purge? I mean, there were purges elsewhere, but Brooklyn is the core of it.
Well, that's a good question, and we don't know because the Board of Elections has not made themselves available for commenting. But the fact is, Hillary did win Brooklyn by 20 points, so I think the voter purge would have hurt her as well as Bernie. And the broader point I've been trying to make about these voting laws, not in New York, but in many other states where Republicans have passed new voting restrictions, like in Wisconsin and North Carolina, the Republicans did this to hurt Democrats broadly. They weren't thinking of Hillary Clinton when they passed these or Bernie Sanders when they passed these. I think they were principally thinking about Barack Obama, quite frankly, and the Obama coalition. But they weren't thinking, oh, it's going to hurt one Democrat or another. They were thinking it's going to hurt the Democratic Party broadly. So I think that Democrats need to stay united on this and realize that in most places they're facing Republican-backed efforts to make it harder for Democratic constituencies to vote. And instead of Hillary and Bernie people arguing about who's suppressing the vote, they should unite to try to make voting easier.
The revolution of 1965 spawned an equally committed counter-revolution. Chief Justice John Roberts, for example, has been trying to weaken the Voting Rights Act for 3 decades, ever since he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, where he wrote memo after memo arguing that violations of the Voting Rights Act should not be made, quote, too easy to prove. That's what he did in the Shelby County decision when he gutted the Voting Rights Act. And as a result of that decision, many new voting restrictions have gone into effect. We heard about what's happening in Texas, where you can vote with a handgun permit and not a student ID. We've heard about what's happening in North Carolina, where they passed the most restrictive anti-voting law since 1965. We heard about what's happening in Arizona, where there are 5-hour lines because Maricopa County eliminated 70% of its polling places. We saw what happened in New York, my home state, this very week, where there were major problems at the polls, including 126,000 registered Democrats purged from the rolls in Brooklyn. Many people don't realize that Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx were also covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because those counties had an English-only literacy test in place as of 1968 and very low minority turnout. So a thing like a voter purge in Brooklyn also would have been reviewed under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but was not reviewed because the law is gutted.
But in New York, it wasn't a Republican. It wasn't Republicans in charge of that, you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I think New York's an exception. But the fact is, New York, despite being a very blue state, has very bad voting laws. And I think that supporters of Hillary and supporters of Bernie after the primary should unite on making these laws better, on making sure New York has things like early voting and same-day registration and channel all that anger into something positive going forward so that the party won't be so close to insurgent candidates, but also so that democracy will work better for everybody going forward.
And bigger picture, not just New York, but I was getting cases where people are telling me, oh, we went to get provisional ballots because the people who filed the lawsuit urged people to file provisional ballots. because if the lawsuit against the Board of Elections was ruled in their favor, maybe provisional ballots would be counted. And they were being told by poll workers, there's no such thing as provisional ballots. You hear a lot, just general either ignorance or incompetence from poll workers telling people the wrong things. One hand doesn't know what the other one's doing. The Board of Elections doesn't really communicate to the local counties that well. Is this just even more, ammo for maybe we need a federal, one federal rule for all the states, or maybe we need to shift more towards online kind of voting?
Well, I've seen this problem in other states. So in North Carolina, for example, they passed a strict voter ID law, but if you couldn't get an ID, you were allowed to vote with a provisional ballot. However, many poll workers were not giving voters that option. So this is a problem in many states, not just New York. I think that we need more federal standards. I think that we need more federal protections. I think it's crazy how different the states are, how some states have open primaries, some states have closed primaries, some states have early voting, some states don't have early voting, some states have election day registration, some states don't. Some states have laws and then change them. It's incredibly confusing for voters. And many other countries don't do it this way. Many other countries have national standards. They have far shorter election periods. They have much less expensive elections. So there's lots that we could learn from other countries. We have this notion of American exceptionalism, but we run our elections about as badly as any advanced democracy.
Do you think that there's going to be more of a push going forward to make it all open? Take the power away from the party establishment? Obviously, that would have helped Bernie Sanders in most of these cases, but why does it make sense that you only let, Democrats vote in certain areas, particularly if the deadlines to make up your mind if you want to be a Democrat could be months before?
I think there is going to be a push to change it. And that's why I think if you're going to have a closed primary, you have to have something like election day registration so that people can participate if they want to. Because not everyone knows they're a Democrat when they're born or 6 months before an election. Some people, particularly younger people, have a more fluid sense of a party. They want to vote in the Democratic Party, but they don't want to necessarily be aligned with the Democratic Party in every single election for the rest of their lives. And that's why I think something like election day registration is important. I will also say that I think caucuses should be abolished too. And Bernie has done very well in caucuses, but caucuses are even more undemocratic. Voter turnout is even lower in caucuses than in primaries, which take a very long time, which are quite complicated, which often happen on weeknights. So I think there's lots of problems with I don't like closed primaries. Without election day registration. I don't like caucuses. I think we should try to make it as easy as possible for as many people as possible to participate.